Hi, my name is Chris Dowgan. I'm the owner of Salem Smugglers Tour in Salem and also the author of Salem's Secret Underground and its sequel Sub Rosa coming out in October. And in this series we're going to talk about the series of tunnels within Salem, Mass and the conspiracies to build them. Before we get that far, we're going to talk about America's first millionaire, Eliza Haskett Derby. He's actually still ranked the 10th richest person in American history. He made that fortune first off the bat as a privateer. Now, if you wonder what the difference between a privateer and a pirate is, it's just a piece of paper. Now, the most famous pirate we have is Blackbeard. Actually, he started off life as a privateer, but forgot to do his paperwork. So, after the war, the Revolutionary War, Eliza Haskett Derby went into the mercantile trade, and he opened up ports in Sumatra where his secret pepper stash was. Also, his ship, the Grand Turk, was the second ship to ever sail from America to China. And actually the supercargo Thomas Perkins that he had hired, we will mention a lot about him later on in the story. So, Eliza, being the America's first millionaire, he didn't start off that way just on his own. He would be married to Mary Crown and Shield. See, now back in Salem, you had two powerful families. One was the Derbys, who were actually Federalists. Now, the Crown and Shields, where Mary Crown and Shield was from, they were Democratic Republicans. So Democratic Republicans, they favored Jefferson, and the Federalists liked Adams. So upon this marriage, the father of Eliza had bought the couple this house. This house now stands on Derby Street across from Derby Wharf. Now, the question in town was, now this is like marrying today, like say the Bushes into the Clinton family. Upon a marriage like this, first of all, I mean, they're political opposites. So what's going on here? It's called game theory. Well, you take two political parties and make sure it's not a third or fourth, because then you could split the shares down in half. Well, everyone else thinks in town you guys are actually fighting each other, but actually you're working together like Pepsi and Coke with their taste challenges that put all the other sodas out of business back in the 80s. So another question, after the people realized that, got past the fact that these two politically opposed families are marrying into each other, the question was, why build such a strong political family, this marriage, this new couple, a brick house? See, the problem in Salem was that nobody ever wanted to live in a brick house. There was once a man who had lived in one. He caught a cold and died. So ever since then, nobody ever wanted to live in a brick house in Salem. So why were these couple moving into this home? The next question they would ask is, what is with the third floor windows? If you look at the picture carefully, they're actually smaller than the first two floors. Well, this concept originally starts off in Amsterdam or in Holland. See, the thing was that this is where the Cape Cod houses originated from. And in Holland at that time, they were trying to get around property taxes. So if you put a second floor in the attic, you don't have to pay second floor's worth of property taxes. Well, they one-upped it in Salem. So if you have windows on the third floor that were half the size, then you don't have to pay taxes on the third floor. So this leads to the next question. People in Salem realize that, the Derbys or the Crown and Shields might be a little cheap by not wanting to pay a third floor in property tax. Then what's with the exterior chimneys? There's 4 of them. Now, all the way up to probably about the 60s, there would always be a central chimney. Eventually your heating system would go through it, but previously it would be actually a fireplace. And the idea of a central chimney is that all 4 sides of that chimney will heat your home. That's why today's fireplaces are so useless, because 3 sides of the chimney are exposed to the elements. Now, in this house in the picture, there's 4 chimneys with 1 face per side exposed to the elements. So if they were so cheap not wanting to pay an extra floor in taxes, why are they wasting all that heating cost? Another question they were asking is, Well, it took a year to put this roof on this house. Very slow construction, they were thinking. Plus, the pile of bricks used to build the home was 3 times the house's finished size. Now, this style of home goes back to the architect Charles Bulfinch. Bulfinch would be famous for creating a series of homes, or a style of homes called Federalist, that would utilize these fireplace arches in the chimneys. Now, what he was doing was he was alleviating an old problem with homes that were connected to tunnels. The problem was now, when your tunnel came to the house, and you had a simple doorway between the two of them, there could be a flashing problem. There could be water dripping on your head as the seepage coming from the ground above finds that little fault between the tunnel and the home. Well, Bulfinch realized that what happens if you actually bring the tunnel into the house through the fireplace arch in the basement? Well, you alleviate that flashing problem. The other thing it does is somewhere in a tunnel there's an opening. And since nature abhors vacuums, as you open up the door to the tunnel into the home, air is pulled up through that chimney through the flue, leaving empty spaces behind that new air needs a rush to fill. So every time you open up the door to your home, it creates a draw system, bringing fresh air into the tunnels, much like you see today's street workers who always have a fan and bellows going into the tunnels that they're working in. So, also about those bricks, well, they weren't really just using the bricks to build the home. The Derbys had a cousin, and he lived directly behind them on the corner of Essex and Orange Street. These cousins, the father and son, were the founder of the organization, the Salem East India Marine Society, who were the founders of what the museum we call today the Peabody Essex Museum. And the Derbys needed to have a tunnel coming from their wharf past their house to the cousin's house on a corner of Essex and Orange Street. So that's where all the extra bricks were going. Well, the Derbys were staying in this house for a short period of time, and they would need larger homes in Salem. The first house they built was right next to it, which is today called the Hawks House. Well, they never moved into that home. They just used it as a storage space for when Liza was sending all his ships off to sea, robbing the British during the Revolutionary War. Eventually, they would then move out of the brick house and bypass the Hawks House completely, and they would move into a mansion that sits currently where the Mason Lodge is on Washington Street in Salem. They lived in that house long enough until they were able to move into their grand palace. This mansion here was Derby's fourth and final mansion. It was based on mansions that were in Venice that was owned by the Medicis. In front of it was Front Street, and at that time it was actually the South River. And people would come to balls at this home by gondola and come up the grand entranceways through the gardens to the house. Now, Derby, he would only be able to live in this home for about a year before he dies. Now, his son, Eliza Haskett Derby Jr., would actually come and take over this mansion. But today, it is the current location of Old Town Hall. Old Town Hall was also built by Bulfinch, who we were mentioning a little bit earlier. Now here's a picture of Derby, or at least Junior. He would be America's first playboy. So he comes back from India and Egypt, where he was running his father's mercantile industry. Eliza Haskett Derby Jr., within 2 years of retirement in Salem, would spend his share of America's first millionaire's inheritance. Remember, this inheritance is equal to what is the 10th richest man in American history's inheritance. Also, the upkeep in the mansion was so grand that also put a little pinch in his budget. So he's going to have to look for a day job. And at the same time as he's looking for a day job, there's a hot contested election going on between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson would come out the winner in this battle between the two of them, and some call it a silent revolution. Now, Adams, he was previously the ambassador to England. He loved everything about England. He was leaning towards creating America as an aristocracy. He would love to be America's first king. Granted, Jefferson did go overseas and offer the throne of America to the Stuart pretender and seeing if he would like to reign in America. But the Stuart had seen what we did to our previous king and denied the offer. And Washington came back and became president. Now we get up to Adams, and he's looking to create a monarchy again. So when Jefferson won, it was called a silent revolution because even though the Constitution didn't go as far as maybe Jefferson wanted, his hopes was that the average person could move west into areas that were unsettled, and with them owning property, would gain the right to vote. And with this vote, America wouldn't be an aristocracy for that much longer. So now back with Eliza Haskett Derby. He's heard, or he caught wind, that Jefferson, while he's in office, he wants to have the customs coming into the Salem port and all the ports in America have new custom duties. And a lot of these supporters of Adams, these Federalists, they don't want to pay these duties. So we'll come up to the Salem Commons next. Originally, the Salem Commons had 5 ponds and a river leading out towards down Forester Street out to Collins Cove. Now, originally it was quite industrial in nature with brass foundries, rope walks, tanneries, and bakeries. Now in 1801, Eliza Haskett Derby Jr. is going to put forth to the town that he's thinking about beautifying this commons here. So Eliza Haskett Derby Jr. is going to put together these subscribers to the Salem Commons Improvement Fund. And what they're going to do first is fill in all those ponds, level the hills, get rid of the marshland, and put a nice wooden fence around the commons. And he's going to use the local militia to do it. Now, Jefferson had asked that the local militia help collect on these duties. At the time that Eliza Haskett Derby Jr. was putting together this park, this beautification plan, the local militia was actually kind of defunct. So before Jefferson or somebody else in town could reorganize a militia, Eliza Haskett Derby Jr. had put together one himself. Even though that this militia that was on the Salem Commons were actually the first National Guard unit in American history, started back in the early 1600s, he's going to have a new purpose for them. So at the time when Eliza Haskett Derby Jr. was putting together the new militia, these are their uniforms. And it was become very smart, or at least to look smart set, that you would join this militia so you can have these uniforms and impress the ladies about town. And all the wealthy started becoming colonels and generals, and after a few years, Eliza Haskett Derby Jr. would move himself up to being general of the 2nd Cadets. So today, this is what the Commons looks like. So the ponds are missing. The river leading out to the Collins Cove is gone. And beyond the tree line, the wooden fence is removed for an iron fence. Now also, if you look around this picture, you'll see these rooftops of these fine mansions. So what Derby's doing is trying to get rid of all this industrial nature, these rope walks and tanneries and brass foundries, and he's trying to convince his subscribers, the wealthy of town and politicians, to actually build fine mansions going around it. And some of these subscribers would include, and people who would move off the Commons, be Associate Superior Court Justice Joseph Story. Another person who would pay for the beautification of the park would be Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Crowninshield. And also paying for the beautification is Secretary of State Timothy Pickering under Adams and Washington. He was Washington's aide-de-camp, and also he's a person who led the first resistance to the British forces in American Revolutionary War at the old North Street Bridge in Salem, Mass. Also, we have another subscriber. It's Nathaniel Silsby, or Senator Silsby, and also Senator Benjamin Pickman. Now, what I wasn't mentioning about the beautification program and the filling in of all those ponds is the fact that as they were leading a bunch of tunnels around the Commons connected to all those new mansions and all these homes of the people I just mentioned around the Commons or throughout town, they were taking all the dirt and hiding it inside those ponds in the river leading out to Collins Cove. In fact, they would remove the breadth of Collins Cove and actually fill in many of the different areas which are now called Webb and Milk Street around that cove to hide the tunnel dirt. Other members of the Salem Commons Improvement Fund included Stephen White, who was going to raise up to be the head of the National Republican Party, which turns into the Whigs for Massachusetts. Also included, there was Liza Haskell Derby Jr. and his various relatives, and also relatives of the Crowninshields and the Peabody family. Beyond these members of the Salem Improvement Fund, there were Stephen White, who was the head of the National Republicans, who became the Whigs for Massachusetts. There was also another Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, would be involved in these tunnels. There would also be half the custom agency. The head of the customs, Joseph Hiller, was one of the smugglers in town. The weighers and gaugers for the custom agency also were part of this scheme. The captain of the revenue cutter out in the harbor, who was supposed to be helping collect on these duties, also was a member. Also, most of the Masons we founded that year were also smugglers. So, according to this list, there was one Associate Superior Court Justice, 2 Secretaries of State, a Secretary of the Navy, 3 or 4 senators, the local mayors, half the custom agency, and most of the ship captains and merchants in town were related to the Derbys and the Crowninshields. Well, we'll take a look at other places that they filled in Salem. Now, this photograph here, on top of the hill closest to us, is where currently the Salem Post Office is. Looking, what would that be? That would be pretty much southeast from where the post office is, or where Riley Plaza is now, was Mill Pond. So in this, to the left, would be the Self River coming in there, which would be now Derby Street. And also that Grand train station would have been in that location where the water is. So this gives you a good idea of how much fill and how much tunnels we were digging and where all that tunnel dirt went. In this picture is what the current location looks like now. This is Riley Plaza, Washington Street, Canal Street, and Washington Street. So it looks a lot different. Now, just up from this last 2 pictures is the house of Joshua Ward. This is the last seafront property from that time period left in Salem. Granted, Washington Street sits in front of it now and it's far away from the South River, but it's still the last seafront property from that time period that's left in Salem. So Joshua Ward, he was married to Edward Augustus Holyoke's daughter. Now, Edward Augustus Holyoke was another smuggler in town, and he's also the founder of the New England Medical Journal. Now, Joshua Ward was also a ship captain, And across the street where today the Adriatic is, or the old Salem News building, was his wharf that was on the South River. And he would also have a home that was built by Charles Bulfinch, or at least designed by Bulfinch's techniques. And here's a picture of Bulfinch. Bulfinch, at the War of 1812, or at its conclusion, would become the architect of D.C. He's the one who builds the Capitol and most of its buildings. And he's also the man who connects all those buildings together by a series of elaborate tunnels. Still today, you can go to the Library of Congress and move between the Jefferson and the Adams building by 6 levels of tunnel, which are actually open to the public. So if you're ever in D.C., go ahead, take a stroll through some of those tunnels. But over here, there's a statue of Joshua Ward. Seems to be a quite jolly fellow. And this here is his portrait that would hang in the Salem Marine Society. Now, the Salem Marine Society was a group of ship captains that would either sail around the Cape of South America or sail around the Cape of Africa. And they would bring back their nautical knowledge and their maps or cartography. And they would also be involved in making local harbors safer for each other and building lighthouses like the 2 lights that would be out on Baker Island in the Salem Harbor. Today, their clubhouse still resides on top of the Hawthorne Hotel, for it was Thomas Perkins who gave the property to the Salem Marine Society, who eventually would sell it to Frank Poor, the founder of Sylvania, so he would have a hotel for his business clients. But they would only sell it to him unless they were able to keep their clubhouse on top of the building. Now, back to the Joshua Ward's house. When Washington needed to take a tour of New England to win over the New England Federalists on his second election, he would stay at the Joshua Ward house. Him being a Mason and all, would want to be where the Masons hang out. See, now in 1801, when the Mason Lodge had reformed after the Revolutionary War, Joshua Ward gave them quarters in his house to meet. So of course, George Washington, being a fellow Mason, would want to stay in the Mason Lodge. He would stay in the 2nd floor on the right, if you're looking at the front of the building. At this time period, he was going to have a grand party while he was in town in his honor. So he'll be the first of our presidents to be able to walk through the tunnels. He was able to walk through that tunnel, which along what's now Washington Street, to the corner of Washington and Essex, where the Fountain Diner is today. In that building, there was originally that location was called the Stearns Building, and they had an assembly hall where they gave a grand party for Washington. And at his closing, he was able to go back through those tunnels, back to the Joshua Ward house, unmolested by the quick sketch artists or the paparazzi of their day. Another president who was probably able to walk through our tunnels was John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams had been coming to Salem since he was a young boy, visiting his cousin. His cousin eventually married Bartholomew Felt. Bartholomew Felt was one of the founding Mormons. In fact, Brigham Young was at his house when they had news that Joseph Smith was assassinated. Another president who was able to walk through our tunnels was James Monroe. He had come to town on bequest of his Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Crowninshield. So he was put up in his house, which was attached to tunnels. Then he was entertained at Nathaniel Silsby's house, which was attached to tunnels. Also, he was able to visit Stephen White's home, which was connected to tunnels. So either they were laughing at the president or allowing him to walk through the tunnels between all these houses and the parties in town. George Washington, he got to be in the Mason Lodge, which was Joshua Ward's home. You could see him in his Masonic gear. Now, the thing about Masons is they're famous for building tunnels. They usually refer to the tunnels in North End of Boston as Mason tunnels. So we'll take a look at one of the tunnels he might have been able to walk through. This tunnel is dead center coming out from the front of the Joshua Ward house, which is the Merchant Hotel, I believe, now in Salem. So for $500 a night, you might be able to get a room that's haunted We'll talk about that in a minute. And maybe the room Washington slept in. But this tunnel here would lead off to Joshua Ward's wharf across the street. And he was moving so many goods, he had an identical tunnel to the left and another one to the right. So actually, time would go by, and there was this company called Ghibli's. And before 1950, they had a building right in front of the Joshua Ward house. And they would actually use these tunnels to move goods from the Joshua Ward house, where they're using it as a warehouse, to their showroom that was on Washington Street. Also in this location was, I think first was Jerry's Army and Navy. That's very famous in Salem too. So imagine in a day, on a cold, wintry night, you needed to get a cup of coffee. Granted, Dunkin' Donuts wasn't around at that time, but if it was, you would be able to use this particular tunnel to probably walk into the Dunkin' Donuts basement, come up and get your coffee, and go back down again and reach the safety of your home without ever touching any snow. But also in this picture, you could actually see that how far these tunnels extended into the homes that were connected to the tunnels, completely alleviating any kind of flashing problem. Now, I did mention ghosts inside the house. This picture here was taken during a Christmas party. The man who owned the Joshua Ward house in the 80s had a real estate company. And they actually had this one woman, Juliette Teche, who would go on and own her own real estate companies in the future, was standing on a staircase, and they took a Polaroid of her, and when they shook the film, waiting for it to develop, this started to be exposed behind her. Now, why would there be a woman on the stairs, or a ghost even, behind her? See, on this property was the home of Sheriff Corwin. Now, Sheriff Corwin was that sheriff who pressed Giles Corey to death and took the end of his cane and shoved his tongue back down his throat. Not the friendliest guy. So he's also the sheriff who arrested everyone else in Salem during their witchcraft trials. But he never made a whole lot of money. And within 5 years, he fell to Giles Corey's curse. Corey said that all sheriffs of Essex County would die gasping on their own blood or blood ailments. Granted, even a sheriff in 1990 took it to heart after he had a heart attack and went on to write a series of local legend books. And it became one of the people who founded Salem Haunted Happenings too. So, back to Sheriff Corwin. 5 years after the witchcraft trials, he actually would die gasping on his own blood. Now, he died in debt to Mr. Philip English, I believe. Now, back then, when you were in debt, the person you were in debt to can actually put a lien on your body until your heirs can pay off that debt. Well, Sheriff Corwin's wife buried him in the basement underneath the staircase before Philip English could get a hold of his body. This is like a symbol of Jacob's Ladder or Stairway to Heaven. There'll be other locations in town, like underneath the old bank property on the corner of Derby Square and Essex, where it has two runaway slaves buried in a tomb underneath another staircase. So years went by, and the wife was able to pay off the debt, and also the town quieted down a little bit. I mean, if she tried burying her husband right after he died, most of the town felt foolish, and they wanted a little bit of revenge for feeling so guilty of what they allowed to happen. And they could have probably pulled Sheriff Corwin's body into quarters and put each of those quarters onto posts on the cardinal points in town. But time goes by, and she was able to safely bury her husband in the Broad Street Cemetery, next to where the son of the author who wrote The Exorcist now resides.